Welcome to Pacific to Nations. My name is Louis Bonifacio, and these video series that we're producing, and we're hoping that it will encourage, inspire, and mobilize our Pacific people for global missions.
Well, in this session, we want to be able to introduce some of the worldview dynamics of what are taking place in the world because of COVID. Obviously, it's affecting the world in many ways. It's affecting missions in many ways. And there's a number of trends that are starting to establish themselves. And as churches, as church leaders, as people doing mission, we're adapting with those changes. The reality is the whole landscape of missions is changing. The face of missions is changing around the world. It's done that consistently. Each generation, things happen, things change. And church history is always assaulted by crisis and situations where the church has to adapt with the Great Commission. And as we look back to the onset of COVID just over a year ago, it's affected the world like none other pandemic, really. The world is just about shut down. Planes aren't flying, people aren't traveling. But the Great Commission still continues on. You know, each generation has seen crisis, but the question is, how does the church rise and adapt to the crisis that it faces itself with? Nothing has changed, and the Great Commission certainly hasn't changed at all. The Great Commission is still the challenge of the church. You know, the reality is, currently 6,000 people daily die because of COVID. That's a lot of people. But the bottom line fact is, over 282,000 people die every day and go straight to hell because they've never heard a clearly expressed gospel message. Yes, 6,000 people die every day because of COVID, and that's tragic. But the greater tragedy is we've got so many people being swept into hell because the Great Commission still hasn't come to closure. And so we still have to keep the main thing the main thing. You know, some of the problems with the Great Commission with COVID, it's minimised people's ability to travel. We know that. So short-term missions aren't taking place anymore. If they are, they're very limited. It means our missionaries can't have furlough. It means if they go home, they may not be able to return to the field. Often these people are restricted to the field. They can't get out of their country with their families, so that's very restrictive. And even if they can't do furloughs, it doesn't mean to say it means to say that they can get home, but they may not be able to travel through the country. It means that they can't promote their work. They can't raise the profile of what's actually happening on their mission field situation. So these are problems that the church is facing, but how do we negotiate around that? Many of these people have visa restrictions superimposed now, so they can't travel within the locations that they're actually finding themselves in. And so quite often missions and Great Commission has been put into the too hard bin. It's just too hard to do this. But we have to be creative as church leaders on how to be able to circumvent these problems. And I guess one of the great trends before COVID happened, we're finding more and more pastors were leaving the comforts of home and they were traveling to visit the missionaries on the field. So they were having mission visitations. The partnerships with missionaries were getting stronger and stronger. There was greater relationships, greater strategic development was taking on the field. So with COVID, that seemed to have changed because people can't get on the plane to travel. But fortunately, we've got Zoom meetings and communication letting these relationships be enhanced. So yes, we do have problems, but we're negotiating around that. Because of smart technology, things have changed totally. We've got the ability to communicate like never before. I was speaking to one person in a restricted country very recently, and he was a Hindu leader, and he couldn't go to a local bookshop and buy the Bible because he wanted to read the Bible. There was no Christian bookshop, but he could actually download an online Bible. Long story short, this guy, a Hindu leader, became a Christian through reading an online Bible through his cell phone app. And so people are still hungry for God, but we have to be wise in how we can deliver fresh ways to present the gospel to people that are looking for answers in this very negative world. How do we turn a negative into a positive? We've got to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit constantly. Each mission situation in the world will be different. No mission station is going to be identical. They may have similar traits and things like that, but they are all different. There are many similarities, and so we just have to be responsive to those situations through good partnerships. We can be on the phone more regularly to connect with some of these people, to encourage the people that are on the field. There are numerous new, what I call entry points into mission. Before there were traditional methods taking place, but now people are engaging in missions locally like never before. More and more churches are picking up initiatives like food banks and feeding programs. There's a lot of people in our own communities that are struggling financially, and the churches are starting to respond more intentionally with that. More and more food programs for people on the street. In our own church, we've had a young married couple pick up responsibility on a regular basis, feeding people on the streets. In Brisbane, another church that I'm working with, they are intentionally targeting children that are living on the streets because their parents have been caught up in alcoholism and gambling, and even many of them are in prison, so the children have fallen through the cracks. But this church is intentionally targeting these young people, so there's many new ways to be able to engage in mission. And so we just have to think, how do we become more creative to reach people? One of my colleagues overseas has a radio station broadcasting from his church, but it's not a conventional radio station broadcasting the gospel. What it's doing is broadcasting a counselling service. So it's like a phone situation where people phone in and they do like a chat connection. And so people are filled with anger and drug addictions and sexual abuse. So these ones have got no place to turn to in society. So they're actually in a safe place where they can call from their homes or their cars, and they're getting counselling over the telephone through this church ministry. And numerous people are getting saved through this journey. And so we just have to be creative, to help people break through these addictions. There are many paradigm shifts taking place. In the old situation, the church found itself squeezed into more traditional ways of doing church, but that caused people to become distant from reality in some respects, distance from God, because it was more clinical. But now, because of COVID, more and more people are having greater quiet times because they got more time at home. Their prayer time has increased because they got more time with God, not just caught up in the busyness of life. Generally, in the old paradigm, people used to come to church. There was like a gathered community, and that was really good. There was an attractional thing. But now people, through COVID, are becoming more what we call scattered. There's more of an intentionality to be outward, and there's more of an outward focus. And it's starting more with local initiatives, but it's starting to broaden to overseas situations as well. The old situations, people came to church, they were attenders. They used to come to church, they used to sit on pews, and they attended church, but they were not really engaged in Great Commission. It was all distant, but now people are wanting to be doers. They're rolling their sleeves up and getting involved in various programs. There's a whole bunch of new things taking place, and I guess the situation is developing all the time with COVID, but we just have to be adaptable with the change. And a lot of young people especially have been courageous. They're starting all sorts of fresh initiatives to encourage not only themselves but their peers to get on board with Great Commission initiatives. Hopefully in other sessions we'll be able to list some of these things for you. Young people are starting home churches, where there's clusters of young people coming together. Yes, they might go to a church, but they're starting pockets of youth groups where people are coming together and doing life together, and are discipling, being discipled together. It's all part of what's happening. And one of the sessions I spoke about recently was where overseas, a young guy who was only 6 to 8 weeks old in the faith, all of a sudden COVID hit, and he ended up living on the far side of the city where he was living from the church. So he couldn't travel an hour and a half to church because they were supposed to be living in their own little community. And so the pastor challenged him to gather people to his own home. So he did. And all of a sudden the house was full. They had 10 people, 25 people within 2 weeks. So the pastor said, well, why don't you split that into 2 groups? Because they're only allowed to gather in groups of 10 people. Well, 8 months later, there's 9 separate groups, with about 10 or 15 people in. And this young guy, only young in the faith, started something, and it was all because of COVID. It wouldn't have happened by the church leadership because they weren't planning for that. And a businessman gave a building for this ministry because people were getting healed, and he heard about what was happening and he wanted to invest in this new community outreach on the far side of the city.